You are useless, Avery. You are the shame of this family." My stepdad said that with a smile in his voice and a beer in his hand right in the middle of my mother's 60th birthday party, at the exact moment a SEAL commander pushed his chair back and stood up. I was not at the table with the cake and the steaks. I was on my knees on the back porch of our small house outside Cincinnati, Ohio, wiping grease off the boards and stuffing empty cans into a trash bag like hired help. My name is Avery Locke. I am 27 years old Navy, and in another world they call me Lieutenant. In this yard, I was just the daughter who never married the one who left, the one everyone whispered about. No chair set aside. No one asking if I had eaten. Just chores and a steady stream of jokes at my expense. Rick lifted his beer and pointed it toward me like a weapon. "You all know my stepdaughter," he told the cousins and church people and neighbors. "She ran off to the Navy because she could not keep a normal job. Vanished for years. You see any checks from her on this table, paying this mortgage, helping her mother? Not a single dime. She hides in uniform because out here she would have to face how useless she really is." The laughter that followed was thin and nervous, the sound I knew from toxic family gatherings, half habit and half fear. No one told him to stop. My mother, Linda, sat beside him in her best blouse hands, nodded in her lap. "Right, honey," he said. "Tell them how she never sends $1 home." She gave a small smile and looked down. She knew I had wired money straight to the bank when the mortgage was late. She knew whose transfer covered the story financial mess he kept creating, but fear kept her quiet. At the end of the table, my little sister Maddie twisted a napkin until it came apart, eyes glued to the mustard so she would not have to look at me. She did not laugh. When our eyes met, she looked sorry and stuck in the same cage I had escaped. I focused on my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way they teach you when you have to keep your head. I had briefed men who go through doors first. None of that counted here. In this yard, I was still the teenager Rick called dead weight. He took another swallow and raised his voice. "And do not let the uniform fool you," he said. "Those big hero SEAL guys, they do not even know she exists. She is not important to them. She just pushes paper. If she disappeared tomorrow, nothing in the real world would change." He had no idea that the man walking up the driveway behind him had once argued with me for an hour over a route and later thanked me because my numbers kept his team out of an ambush. My mother had gone inside for ice. When she came back out, she was not alone. Behind her was a tall man in a plain shirt and jeans, short hair, the straight posture you can spot even without the uniform. I knew that shape before I saw his face. Captain Harrison Cole, commander of a SEAL task force, the last person I expected to see in my mother's backyard. Harrison stopped at the edge of the patio and took in the scene. The crowded table, the balloon, arched me on the porch with a trash bag in my hand. Rick turned, saw a stranger and put on the smooth act he saved for outsiders. "You lost Buddy. This is a private party. Unless you are here to see my stepdaughter," he jerked his chin at me. "The useless one. She is the family shame we were just talking about." Harrison did not look at him. His eyes found mine and held. Then his jaw tightened. The metal legs of his chair scraped as he pushed it back from the folding table. Conversation died at the sound. He stepped up onto the porch shoes, solid on the boards, and did something no one in my family had ever done. In front of my stepdad, my relatives, my neighbors, and the woman who brought me into the world. Captain Harrison Cole came to attention and raised his hand to his forehead. "Lieutenant Lockmom," he said, his voice carrying into the quiet. "Task Force 7 and my SEAL team are alive because of you." The air went thin. A fork dropped and clicked against a plate. Maddie's mouth fell open. My mother covered her lips with one shaking hand. Rick stared at Harrison, then at me like he was seeing a stranger. In that frozen second, something inside me moved. For years, his version of me had been the only one allowed in this yard. But with a SEAL commander saluting the daughter he called useless, I knew the betrayal family karma had finally turned, and this time it was not turning on me. It was turning on him. When I think back to the years between 13 and 16, the winters in Cincinnati always come first. The ice on I-75, the night my father's truck skidded across the lanes and never made it home, the way the phone rang and my mother Linda fell to the floor before anyone said a word, and after that, nothing in our small house felt steady anymore. Not the walls, not the clocks, not the sound of her voice. She worked double shifts at the clinic, came home with her scrubs smelling of disinfectant and exhaustion, and still tried to keep my little sister Maddie in clean clothes and me in school. But grief eats time, the way cold eats skin, and she was drowning in both when Rick Dalton walked into our church one Sunday morning carrying a Bible that looked brand new, smiling at my mother like he was offering her a life raft. At first, he was the kind of man everyone said we needed. He fixed the loose railing on our porch without being asked. He drove me to school when my mother worked mornings. He brought groceries and paid for a new heater. And for a short while, I believed that this was what stability felt like, a strong adult who made the weight in the house lighter, not heavier. But stability turns to control faster than a teenage girl can understand. It started with small comments, the kind that sound like advice but land, like warnings. Comments about how a girl should behave, how a girl should dress, how a girl should think. And then one night at dinner, he looked at me across the table and said, "Women need to stay home and learn to tend to family, not chase after fantasies." My mother said nothing. Her fork paused in mid-air, and Rick nodded as if her silence was agreement, not fear. I had been dreaming of joining JROTC at school because I loved the idea of discipline, of purpose, of wearing a uniform that meant something. So when I picked up the application form and brought it home, my mother gave a tiny, proud smile, the kind mothers give when they see a spark in their child. But Rick walked into the kitchen before she could finish the expression. He took the form from my hands, skimmed it, and tore it down the middle, then again into quarters, letting the pieces fall into the trash like scraps that did not matter, telling me we need someone to watch Maddie, not a pretend hero who thinks the world is waiting for her. The humiliation tightened around my ribs, but I kept my mouth shut because arguing always made things worse. That weekend, he hosted a cookout for the relatives who lived nearby, uncles from Indiana, cousins from Kentucky, old neighbors who stopped by for grilled corn and cheap beer. And in the middle of the yard, he told everyone the story of my JROTC form, as if it was comedy, saying, "Little Avery wants to be special forces. Can you imagine that good thing? I am here to keep her feet on the ground." People laughed, the nervous kind of laughter that shows submission, not joy. And my mother stood behind the picnic table arranging buns, so she did not have to look anyone in the eye. That was the first time I understood the strange gravity in a toxic family, how the loudest person in the room can bend the truth until everyone else believes it is the weather we all must live in. I swallowed the shame because 13-year-olds do not have many choices, but inside I felt something harden, a quiet decision, that if no one in that yard would see who I really was, then one day I would step so far beyond their small expectations that they would be forced to confront what they had thrown away. Money became the next arena where he marked his territory. My mother handed him her paychecks to keep the household running, and he kept the books, or claimed he did, but somehow there was never enough for school trips or new sneakers unless he approved them. And every time I asked, he said, "No one owes you anything. You contribute nothing, so you get nothing." And my mother whispered apologies when he left the room. I realized later that this was the beginning of the story, financial tilt that shaped my teenage years. He controlled the income, he controlled the narrative, and he controlled the way every relative understood our family. I was the burden. He was the savior. That was the story he sold and everyone bought because it was easier than questioning the man who spoke with absolute confidence. The injustice escalated again when I turned 15 and asked about taking honors classes because my teachers thought I could handle the workload. But Rick told me not to waste time on things that would never matter. He said girls from families like ours do not make careers, they make dinner. And my mother's silence stretched across the room like a long, thin shadow that never ended. I learned not to expect praise and not to expect fairness. I learned to keep my achievements quiet because they only triggered new ways for him to dismiss me. On a late autumn afternoon during my sophomore year, while the trees outside the school library shed their leaves faster than the janitors could sweep them, I sat alone flipping through college brochures the school counselor had left on a cart, pages full of places I assumed were out of reach. I was not looking for anything specific when I found a small folded pamphlet tucked between two thick catalogs. It was navy blue with the words Naval Intelligence across the front. Inside were photos of young officers working with maps, radio satellite images, and beneath one picture was a line that said, "We need people who see what others miss." The sentence stopped me. It felt like someone had spoken directly to the part of me Rick could not crush, the part still watching everything, the part still analyzing every pattern in his behavior, the part that saw how people bent under pressure and how lies moved through a room like smoke looking for oxygen. I read that line again and felt the smallest spark of recognition, the thought that maybe the world had a place for a girl who noticed things, a girl who learned in silence because she was never allowed to speak. I folded the pamphlet carefully and slipped it between my notebooks so Rick would never see it. And as I walked home past rows of houses glowing with warm porch lights, I whispered to myself that one day I would become the kind of person who saw the truth before anyone else, even if no one in my family believed in that truth yet. By the summer after that pamphlet found its way into my hands, I had learned that humiliation in our family rarely happened behind closed doors. It bloomed in the open air where everyone could see it, especially on days that were supposed to feel joyful, and nothing proved it more than the 4th of July barbecue in our backyard, the yearly gathering where uncles from Dayton and cousins from Louisville came with coolers and folding chairs, where neighbors drifted over because Rick liked the audience, and where my mother worked herself into exhaustion trying to make everything look festive so no one would see the cracks in our home. The grill smoked from early morning, the picnic table covered in red and white paper cloth, the children chasing each other with sparklers, while adults compared how well their kids were doing. And I stood at the edge of the porch with a tray of buns pretending the heat in my chest was from the weather, not from the knowledge that a public shaming was coming, because Rick never let a crowd go to waste. Every conversation around me seemed to be about someone else's success scholarships to Ohio State, acceptance letters from private colleges, varsity sports debate tournaments, summer internships, and I listened quietly, even though my own grades were high enough to earn compliments from teachers, even though counselors had hinted that I could apply for scholarships if I wanted to, not that the idea mattered here, because in this yard no one asked what I had accomplished. It was easier for them to accept the story they already believed. The first sting came when Aunt Marlene, who always put on a bright smile even when she gossiped behind other people's backs, turned to me and asked what I planned to study after graduation, a question so harmless it should have felt encouraging. So I told her softly that I wanted to apply to ROTC and maybe join the Navy, because something inside me was drawn to structure and purpose. But before the sentence fully formed, Rick let out a booming laugh that cut through the music and chatter like a blade. "Her," he said to the whole table. "She cannot even change a light bulb without calling for help. You think she is going off to the military." The group erupted in chuckles, loud from some, nervous from others, and I stood still with my cheeks burning, wishing the ground would swallow me, because the humiliation did not come from what he said, but from the way everyone accepted it as truth, simply because he spoke first and he spoke loudest. The second wound came weeks later during a small school assembly. I had been given a modest academic award, nothing major, a recognition for consistent grades, but it meant something to me, because I had earned it on my own, and the school invited me to say a few words on stage. My mother came and clapped quietly in the back row, but Rick stood with his arms crossed and an expression that made the applause feel hollow. When we returned home, he told the relatives on the phone that the award was a pity prize. the kind schools give to keep nerdy kids from feeling bad, and he told them not to make a fuss about it because the real world would swallow me the minute I stepped outside our front door. Later that night, he pulled the small certificate from my hands, slid it into a drawer of miscellaneous junk, and told me not to clutter the living room with meaningless things because we only display accomplishments that matter. His voice had that familiar calm that made the insult sharper, the tone that said he was not being cruel, he was being practical, and my mother stood behind him unable to choose between protecting me and keeping the peace. The third and hardest blow happened one humid evening when the mosquitoes buzzed against the kitchen screen and the house smelled faintly of grass clippings because Rick had just mowed the lawn. I came home from studying at the library and paused at the door when I heard his voice drifting from the driveway where he was speaking to our neighbor, Mr. Evans, the man who lent us his tools sometimes. "She will never leave this house." Rick said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "She does not have the backbone. She is useless." And the word landed inside me like a stamp, pressed onto my skin, hot and permanent. I knew then that this was not teasing or irritation. It was a verdict, a judgment passed without trial, a definition he intended to give me for life. Until that moment, the word had floated around in implied ways, but hearing it spoken so plainly with such certainty stripped something raw inside me and made me walk away from the door because I did not want him to know I had heard. I did not want to give him the satisfaction of seeing the hurt. That night, I lay awake replaying every time he had smiled while telling a story about me that was not true. Every time he had turned my choices into punchlines at family gatherings, every time he had shaped the narrative so that my relatives saw me not as a struggling teenager, but as a disappointment who had chosen failure. It was a kind of family betrayal that felt so ordinary, it was invisible, the type of betrayal that spreads quietly, because people are used to adults speaking over the heads of children. The twist, the first shift in this long pattern, came unexpectedly near the end of the school year when a Navy recruiter visited our homeroom. He was tall, confident, with a calm authority that filled the room without effort, and he talked about opportunity discipline, financial support, futures, built on ability rather than background. When he came to speak with me individually after reviewing my test scores, he said something that no one in my life had ever said. "If you want justice for yourself, the military is a place where people look at what you can do, not what they think you are." Justice. I had only heard that word used in sermons or arguments between adults, never as a promise directed at me, and hearing it from someone who had walked through real danger made it feel like a lifeline. It planted itself deeper than the shame, deeper than the insults. And for the first time, I felt the shape of a future that did not depend on Rick's permission or approval. It was the first moment I understood that the world was bigger than one backyard, bigger than one man who needed me to stay small. And as I left the classroom that day with the recruiter's card in my pocket, I felt the tiniest flicker of power, not enough to erase the label useless, but enough to make me question whether that label had ever belonged to me at all. By the time I sat in the cramped testing room at the recruiting office with the ASVAB booklet in front of me, the word useless was still echoing somewhere in the back of my mind, but it had started to lose its grip. The recruiter's card burned a quiet line in my pocket, and I told myself that if I failed, I could always pretend this never happened yet. Question after question unfolded like a language my brain already knew. Patterns in numbers, shapes, mechanical reasoning, logic puzzles that felt less like a test and more like someone finally asking me to use the part of my mind I had been hiding when the proctor called time. I handed in my sheet with a calmness that surprised me. And 2 days later, the recruiter called me into his office, slid the score report across the desk, and his smile told me the result before I saw the numbers. "This is very high," he said, tapping the page. "You have options most people never see with this. We can look at intelligence work analysis, maybe officer track later. If you push through school." Then he talked about clearances and missions, where people like you sit in rooms full of screens and signals and find the one detail that keeps others alive. And as he spoke, I felt something shift inside me, like someone had opened a window in a house I thought would always be dark. I asked if it was dangerous, and he shrugged in that honest way. Soldiers have saying, everything has risk, but some risks are worth taking if you are tired of being stuck. And when I walked out into the parking lot, the air felt sharper, like I could finally see a road that did not end at our cracked driveway and the dented truck Rick kept promising to fix someday, but never did. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a future that did not include his voice in every room. I did not tell him anything at first. I started with my mother at the kitchen table late one night when Maddie was asleep, and the glow of the television drifted in from the living room. I laid out the brochures and the score report and repeated what the recruiter had said about training and pay and how the Navy could cover college. And as I talked, my mother's eyes filled with tears, a mix of fear and something like pride. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers cold and shaking. "Avery, I always knew you were made for more than this house," she whispered. "But the world is rough, and you are still my little girl. I do not want to lose you." Yet even through the fear, I saw relief flicker on her face, the relief of someone who has watched a child get crushed under a family label and finally hears a different verdict. She traced the numbers on the page like they were proof she had not been crazy all these years, for believing I was capable of more than wiping counters and watching Maddie. We did not hear Rick come in until his keys hit the counter. He stopped in the doorway and took in the papers spread between us, his jaw tightening as he understood exactly what they meant. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice already loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the thin kitchen window. "You planning to run off and leave your mother here to pay the mortgage alone? You think the Navy is going to come shovel the snow and fix the roof for free?" I told him as calmly as I could that I would have housing and steady pay, that I could send money home, that I would not be a child forever, that this was my life. But he only heard one thing, that I was slipping out of the role he had written for me in his drama family. So he called me selfish and accused me of trying to make myself the main character, while he and my mother were left as background. He said real family sticks together, and that by leaving, I was betraying us, twisting the idea of loyalty into another chain around my ankle. My mother sat between us with her hands clenched in her lap like a referee who knew the game had been fixed long before she walked onto the field. Then he changed tactics, his anger cooling into something sharper. He pulled out a chair and sat down, like we were at a business meeting. "Maybe we can work something out." He said, "The shop needs to expand and the bank likes young, clean credit histories. If you sign a small loan with me, I will support this enlistment idea. I will tell everyone I am proud of you. I will even drive you to the processing station." He dangled the word support in front of me like a treat in front of a dog, as if my future was a coupon. He could trade for more tools and chrome in his garage for a second. My tired brain almost grabbed at it because the idea of him not screaming for once felt like a miracle. Then the second passed, and the truth settled in my stomach like a stone. He was not offering me support. He was trying to tie my future to his debt, so that even if my body left this house, my name and my credit would stay chained to his choices. The recruiter had talked about battles fought with information, instead of weapons, about a kind of quiet conflict justice, where you learn to read the fine print before it destroys you. And I suddenly understood that this was one of those battles, not loud like our usual shouting matches, but a quiet war over my autonomy and over whether I would always exist as an extension of Rick Dalton. For the first time in my life, I heard my own voice say, a clean no. Not a soft, maybe not a half step toward compromise. Just that one small word hanging in the air between us. My mother flinched like she had been hit. Rick slammed his hand on the table so hard the salt shaker jumped and rattled to the edge. He shouted that if I walked out without helping him, I was dead to this family, that he would not speak my name again, that I would go off and get myself hurt in some pointless war, and no one would even claim the body he spit out useless one more time, like it was a curse. He could hang around my neck to keep me from moving, My heart pounded so hard I could taste metal, but I did not back down. I told him I would sign the enlistment papers, but not his loan, that I would not put my name on anything he controlled. And behind the fury in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. A thin line of fear that his grip was slipping and he could not stop it. The days that followed were heavy and quiet. He stomped and slammed doors and muttered useless under his breath. Whenever I walked past, my mother moved like a shadow, trying not to set him off, and I focused on the dates circled on my calendar when I would ship out, counting the nights like a prisoner tracing lines on a concrete wall I knew from long practice that I could not win by charging straight at him. Our toxic family patterns had been built too carefully around his temper, so instead I chose a different path, a kind of quiet justice that did not look like revenge on the surface, but was the first real step in taking back my story. I gathered the small savings I had from babysitting and part-time shifts, at the grocery store folded bills and a few worn checks, and went to the bank alone, my hands sweating, as I waited in line under the humming fluorescent lights. When it was my turn, I told the woman at the desk I wanted to make a payment directly to the mortgage. I gave her the account number from one of my mother's old statements and watched as she typed. Then I asked, as steadily as I could, if she could note in the file that no one was to use my name for any new loans without my direct consent. I did not explain why I just held her gaze until she nodded and said she would flag the account. It was not a fortune, but it was mine, and I was choosing to use it to help secure a roof over my mother's head, instead of feeding his business dreams that night. When the house was finally quiet, I opened an old laptop, created a new email address, and wrote to an old friend of my mother's who had become a lawyer. I did not say who I was. I simply described a man pressuring a young woman in his household to co-sign risky loans, a pattern of control and financial manipulation, and asked what protections someone like that might have. Then I hit send before I could lose my nerve and close the computer with shaking hands. Those two simple actions did not look like the revenge stories people whisper about. There were no raised voices and no dramatic exits, but they were my first deliberate moves in a long battle, small acts of protection in a house where protection had always been reserved for the man who shouted the loudest. And as I folded my early issue uniforms into a plain duffel bag, weeks later, I knew that even if Rick never learned exactly what I had done, the balance of power over my life had already begun very quietly to shift away from him and toward me. Boot camp stripped everything familiar off me, the clothes, the hair, the way I walked, and even the way I thought about my own body. But it did not touch the part of me that had always watched, always listened, the part that had grown up mapping the moods in a toxic family like weather. So, when the drill instructors screamed and the recruits around me shook, I found myself doing what I had always done, cataloging patterns, who broke under pressure, who performed better when they were yelled at, and who quietly excelled when no one was watching, the rhythm of the runs, the timing of inspections, the way certain instructors softened their tone right before they decided to crush someone. All of it slid into some mental file. Not because I chose to gather the data, but because that is simply how my mind works. And even when my muscles ached and my lungs burned, and I wondered if I'd been insane to think I could do this, I also knew there was nowhere Rick could reach me here. No backyard, no neighbors, no one nodding along to his version of me. After boot camp, they sent me to San Diego, the air sharp with salt and jet fuel, the base spread out under a sun that seemed determined to bake every illusion away. And there, I started real training for naval intelligence, long days in windowless rooms, full of screens and maps and streams of information that would have overwhelmed most people, but for me felt strangely familiar. It was like sitting in the middle of all the unspoken things I had sensed my whole life, and finally being told I was allowed to notice them. I learned how to read signals, watch radio traffic, interpret patterns in movements on satellite images. I learned that a blip in static or a slight change in timing could mean a convoy was about to get hit, or a safe route was no longer safe. And the more complex the puzzle, the calmer. I became the instructors started using my test runs as answer keys, and one of them, a tired-looking chief with kind eyes, told me quietly that some people are born with the ability to see what everyone else is missing, and that if I wanted to survive in this world, I needed to treat that ability as a gift, not a burden. Eventually, my name landed on an assignment list for a joint Special Operations Task Force that supported SEAL Team 7 on deployments, and when I saw it, I felt a jolt of fear and pride all at once, because special operations meant the stakes were higher, the missions darker the margin, for error razor thin. It also meant my work would be buried under classification stamps so deep that no one at home would ever hear even the outline. My family betrayal story would stay frozen in the version Rick told, while out here, I would be living a different story entirely. The first time I met Captain Harrison Cole, he walked into the secure briefing room with the quiet authority of someone who has been shot at more times than he can count his uniform, crisp. His eyes scanning the room with that particular focus combat officers have, and I could feel his skepticism when he saw a young intel officer, barely into her 20s, sitting among senior analysts who had been doing this longer than I had been alive. He nodded to me politely, but his body language said what his mouth did not, that I was another desk-bound staffer who would bury him in reports, while he and his men handled the real work. I did not take it personally. I had grown up around men who underestimated me. In some ways, his doubt felt almost comfortable. Our first major operation together started like many others chatter in a region where chatter meant someone was planning something ugly. Intercepted communications that did not quite line up with known patterns, a convoy route that had been safe last month suddenly lit up with strange noise on certain frequencies. The senior analysts in the room leaned toward one conclusion, that it was random interference. Maybe local broadcasts, nothing to worry about. But my mind kept snagging on repeating gaps in the noise, thin little silences tucked between bursts of static. Too regular to be accidental, like someone breathing in the wrong place in a sentence. I pulled the data apart 3 different ways, and each time, the same structure emerged a ghost footprint of something that was not supposed to be there. So I told the room that to my eye it looked like concealed communication, likely coordinating an ambush along the route they were planning to use. The older men pushed back immediately. This pattern is too faint. They said we cannot change an entire operation on the guess of a junior officer. We have to stick to the plan or we will lose the window. Their tone was professional, but there was an edge of condescension. I knew well the same edge Rick had when he told relatives my achievements were pity prizes. For a moment, I almost backed off, almost let the room roll over me the way my family always had. But then I thought of the recruiter, telling me this was a place where justice came in the form of merit, not opinion. So I held my ground, laid out my reasoning in clear, cold steps, pointed to every repetition, every anomaly, every tiny inconsistency, until finally the room quieted and Captain Cole looked at me for a long time, his jaw tight before turning to the operations officer and ordering an adjustment to the route. "We are not sending men through that zone until we know exactly what that noise is," he said. "If she is wrong, we lose a couple of hours. If she is right and we ignore her, we send body bags home." The mission went ahead with the altered plan, and later we learned from a combination of drone footage and intercepted enemy communication that there had in fact been an ambush set right where the route had originally been drawn. Hidden IEDs and fighters in position, waiting the change in timing and direction, force them to move, expose them. And instead of walking into a kill zone, the SEALs were able to hit from a different angle and get out with minor injuries instead of casualties. At least 12 men who would have died came back breathing because of that shift. And when the after-action review ran my pattern, analysis was called out explicitly, not as a footnote, but as a primary factor. That was the moment the nickname started at first, as a joke. One of the operators called into the secure line and said, "Put Ghost Compass on this. She sees things the rest of us do not." The phrase stuck, passed from team to team. Soon, people I had never met were referring to me that way. In internal messages and in small closed briefings, my name appeared in slides as one of the youngest analysts given that level of trust. It was a strange kind of fame, bright and invisible. At the same time, glowing behind layers of secrecy that the outside world would never see. And the more the community relied on me, the more surreal it felt to imagine my stepfather still sitting in our sagging backyard chair, telling neighbors I would never amount to anything. Over time, Captain Cole changed the way he spoke to me. The initial skepticism shifted into a kind of blunt respect. He asked for my opinion directly during planning. Instead of letting it filter up through others, he listened when I flagged something as off. And he once told me in a rare, quiet moment between back-to-back missions that he had lost good men because someone ignored a soft signal. I would rather be wrong with you 10 times than ignore you once when you are right, he said. And that sentence settled into me like a counterweight against every time Rick had called me useless, like proof that in a world where life and death actually hung on decisions, my mind had value. When the commendation came, it was almost an afterthought, a short internal ceremony in a secure auditorium where phones were locked away and no one outside those walls would ever know what citations were being read. I stood at attention while a senior officer pinned Navy and Marine Corps commendation, metal green and white ribbon to my chest for sustained superior performance in support of special operations. My hands steady even as my heart tried to climb into my throat. There were applause and a few whistles from the SEALs in the back, but what stayed with me was a small envelope someone pressed into my palm. Afterward, the handwriting on the front, unfamiliar inside, was a short letter from one of the operators whose team had been on that rerouted convoy. He wrote that he had a daughter back home who still had a father because I had insisted on what I saw. He wrote that if my family ever called me useless, then they did not understand justice at all, because in his eyes I had already given more to protect others than most people would in a lifetime. I read it 3 times in the dim light of my quarters, and then placed it carefully between pages of a manual tucked where no one would find it. And that night, I almost called my mother to tell her everything, to finally offer her a version of me that did not match Rick's stories, but classification rules wrapped tight around my tongue. I could tell her I worked in intelligence. I could tell her I was doing well, but I could not describe missions or names or details. All the proof had to stay locked away. So while the Navy quietly built a legend out of the girl who saw what others missed back in Ohio, I remained the daughter who had run away, the niece who never came to barbecues, the punchline in my stepfather's revenge stories about ungrateful kids. It was a new kind of injustice, being honored in rooms she would never see, while still being dismissed in the one place that should have been my first home. And I carried that contradiction with me like another classified file, sealed tight, waiting for the day the truth would finally be allowed to step into the light. By the time I reached 25, the double life I was living had become so sharply divided that I sometimes felt as if I stepped through 2 different doorways each time I moved between deployments and home. In one world, I sat in secure rooms where people twice my age waited for my assessment before they moved men into danger. In the other, I became the daughter who was still portrayed as unreliable, selfish, barely competent. And it was during a rare lull between rotations that my phone rang at 3 a.m. California time, my mother's number glowing on the screen, her voice shaking, before I even had time to sit up. She tried to tell me calmly that the mortgage was behind and they had received a notice from the bank, but the words tangled together as she cried softly, and then suddenly the tone changed because Rick had taken the phone from her, his breath heavy, his voice thick with false outrage as he snapped that if I did not start sending money home, the house would be gone and everyone would know I had abandoned them. He accused me of being betrayal, family karma, a daughter who wanted to look noble in uniform while her mother drowned in bills. He said that while I played important out west, he was the one carrying the weight of an entire household. He made it sound as if the mortgage was behind because of my absence, not because he had drained funds into the shop again, and I listened because years of conditioning had trained me to go still when he used that voice, the voice that mixed anger with guilt until you could not tell which was supposed to hurt more. When he finally stopped talking, I asked quietly to speak to my mother again, but he refused, and hung up, leaving me staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks room. My breath tight, the contrast between who I was in this building and who I became in that Ohio kitchen pressing against my ribs like a vice I could not abandon. My mother, she had spent years absorbing his storms, so Maddie and I would have pieces of peace. So first thing in the morning, I went to the base bank and wired money directly to the mortgage account. Not through Rick, never through Rick, because I had seen enough of his financial tricks to understand how quickly money disappeared around him. Once the transaction cleared, I called my mother at a time I knew he would be out. She whispered, "Thank you again and again," but then lowered her voice even further and asked me not to tell Rick because he wanted to feel like he was the only one saving the house. And the old ache rose inside me, the ache of a woman forced to live in silence so that a man could feel powerful. I returned to San Diego thinking at least the crisis was handled, but Rick did not let it go. Instead, he reshaped the story to protect his pride. He told relatives I had refused to help, that I had cut contact, that I cared more about Special Forces men in California than about my own mother. So when I came home on short leave that winter, I walked into a living room full of sideways glances and thinly veiled questions. A cousin asked if it was true. I had not sent a single dollar. Since joining, an aunt asked whether I realized how hard life had been for my mother. And Rick stood in the doorway performing the exhausted patriarch, sighing deeply, shaking his head as if he regretted telling them anything, letting them think he had carried the burden alone. I wanted to scream, but I looked at my mother's face and saw the fear carved into her expression. The fear that if I challenged him openly, he would unleash the same rage on her as he had on me years before, so I swallowed the words, reminded myself that survival sometimes required patience, even when justice felt far away. The more time passed, the more I realized that money was Rick's sharpest weapon. He used guilt as currency weaving story financial narratives, where he always appeared as savior and I as debtor. So I decided to take a step he would never anticipate. I contacted Jade, a friend of my mother's from years ago who had become an attorney in Cincinnati. I asked her to check public records and anything she could legally view. She sent back a long message filled with things I had feared but needed confirmed. Rick had taken out multiple credit cards, including one with high interest, and he had purchased a shiny used truck with financing. He told everyone was for the good of the shop, yet the records showed no payments tied to business improvements, only personal spending. Nothing about him sacrificing for the family matched the truth on paper, and seeing the facts laid out so clearly grounded reminded me that control often works by obscuring numbers until people doubt their own instincts. I kept the information to myself because exposing it too soon would only give him more reasons to twist the narrative. Instead, I started laying quiet groundwork. I researched nonprofits that assisted women in mentally abusive relationships, places that offered counseling, legal guidance, safety planning resources my mother had been denied for years because she thought enduring made her loyal. I slipped a card from one of these organizations into her purse during a visit home, not with a speech, not with pressure, just a silent lifeline she could choose to hold later. I also opened a small account in her name, without Rick's knowledge linking it to my own, so I could deposit money every month. Even if the amount was modest, it was hers untouched by him. Hers in a way nothing else in that house was, and each quiet step felt like a form of conflict. Justice, small but deliberate movements that pushed back against years of control. The real twist came on an afternoon when I arrived unannounced between rotations, hoping to spend an hour with Maddie before flying out again. I walked through the side gate and froze when I heard Rick's voice drifting from the yard. He was talking to Mr. Evans, the same neighbor who had once listened while Rick called me useless, and his tone had that smug certainty that made my stomach clench. When Linda is gone, Rick said the house will be split between me and Maddie Avery. Does not deserve a thing she abandoned us. She is too proud to need this place anyway. It is better if everything stays with the people who were actually here. His words rolled out like a final verdict, not only rewriting the past but erasing my future place in the family entirely. And something cold settled into me as I stood completely still behind the fence. The realization that this was no longer just about debt or guilt or manipulation. This was revenge, inheritance drama. Family unfolding right in front of me, a man positioning himself to cut me out of my mother's legacy while pretending he was protecting the family as if everything she had worked for belonged to him by default. I stepped away before they could see me, my pulse steady in a way that surprised me because the anger had turned into clarity, a calm recognition that this was a battle of truth against illusion, that every quiet action I had taken so far had been necessary preparation for something larger. The gap between the way the Navy valued me and the way Rick diminished me had never felt wider, and in that widening, I felt a growing strength, a reminder that justice sometimes moves slowly, gathering weight until the moment it finally reveals itself in a way no one can ignore. The months that followed blurred together in a way I had not expected. Long rotations, long nights, operations that stretched across time zones until sunrise and sunset lost meaning, and somewhere in the middle of it, my mind began slipping into a strange exhaustion. Not the physical kind that boot camp had drilled out of me, but the heavy, quiet kind that sits behind your ribs and does not leave even when you sleep on this deployment. The tempo was faster and the stakes higher. Intelligence coming in waves, signals that pulsed with tension, operators moving in and out of the hangars with faces carved by fatigue, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the paths we mapped on the screen, each line containing possibilities for life or death. It was the kind of rotation that leaves shadows behind your thoughts. Sleep came in shallow fragments broken by sudden jolts of alertness, my mind replaying transmissions I had already analyzed, part habit and part fear of missing something. And though I kept moving the way I was trained to do, something inside me began to wear thin, a small tear at the edge of the discipline I had built. One night when the base had gone quiet and the hum of the generators outside my container room was the only sound, I stared at the small locker where I kept my ribbons and commendation pinned neatly in rows, reminders of missions where the men came back alive because I saw something others missed. I ran my fingers over the cool metal, and instead of pride, I felt a hollow space open, a strange emptiness that made me reach for my phone because I thought hearing my mother's voice might steady me. When she answered, her tone was soft but distant. She asked if I was eating enough and if I was being careful, and I could hear the television murmuring in the background. Then before I could say much more, Rick's voice cut into the call, heavy and irritated, as if my timing had personally insulted him. He grabbed the phone and launched into a tirade about bills, about the shop being slow, about the mortgage notice still haunting the corner of the kitchen counter. He did not ask if I was safe or where I was or what I had been doing. He did not care that I was on the other side of the world. He only cared that his life was not running the way he wanted, and that made me the perfect target for blame. He said I never helped. He said my work was worthless compared to real labor. He said I acted as if being around special forces made me better than the rest of them, and that if I really cared about family, I would come home and help him with the business instead of hiding behind screens. My mother's voice slipped in again, thin and careful, telling me to breathe, telling me to focus on my duties, telling me family sometimes speaks out of stress. And even though she meant well, the words cracked something inside me. Because it felt like she was asking me to keep carrying wounds, she did not know how to heal the kind that deepen without ever bleeding. Days later, he called again during a brief window of downtime, and this time he did not bother with a long complaint. He went straight to an ultimatum. If you do not come home and help with the shop, you are no longer part of this family. You might as well stay gone because you clearly love the Navy more than your own blood. His voice grew sharper with each sentence. He called me useless to the military and useless to the family, as if saying it enough times would make it true. And in that moment, the light in my small room flickered and buzzed overhead. But the real flicker was inside me. A sudden collapse of something I had held together for too long. When the call ended, I sat there in the dim room, my phone still in my hand, my breath uneven, staring at the metal on my blanket as if it belonged to someone else. I whispered to myself that 12 men had gone home because I caught a pattern in static, that commanders trusted me, that teams relied on me. Yet my own stepfather still pictured me as dead weight, and my own mother still believed peace meant silence. And the contradiction left me feeling weightless in the worst way, like I had built a life that had no bridge back to the place that was supposed to be home. I needed to do something, anything, to reclaim a sense of control. So I opened my laptop and typed out a message to the pastor at our old church, the one Rick liked to impress, with stories of hard work and sacrifice. I did not name myself. I did not identify Rick directly. I simply described a situation where a man manipulated his family with guilt, where he used control as a weapon, where he warped truth to hold power, where the people around him suffered in silence because they thought that was what loyalty required. I asked if the church ever talked about emotional coercion and what Scripture said about deception within families. Then I sent it and closed the laptop, not expecting much, but feeling the smallest bit lighter for having done something honest. Weeks later, my mother mentioned that the pastor had delivered a sermon about manipulation, about people who twist commitment into chains, and she said Rick was visibly irritated during the service, shifting in the pew, jaw tense, muttering under his breath afterward that preachers needed to mind their own business. And though he never connected the dots, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that a mirror had been held up to him in the one place he thought he controlled the narrative. But the deeper break came, late one evening when I was reviewing signal logs and my phone buzzed with a message from Maddie, her name lighting up the screen with an urgency that made my heart stop. The picture she sent was blurry but unmistakable. Her wrist wrapped in faint purplish marks. She wrote that she had dropped a bottle of beer in the kitchen, and Rick grabbed her too hard because he said she was careless. She tried to soften it with words like, "It is not that bad," but I could see fear in the uneven text, the way her sentences trailed off, and something inside me shifted from sorrow to something sharper, steadier. The kind of clarity that comes when the situation stops being about pride or history and becomes about safety, real safety that can be broken in one moment of rage. I stared at the image for a long time, the hum of the bass echoing in my ears, realizing that this was no longer an emotional wound that could be endured, until I escaped again. This was a warning that the house I had left behind had become dangerous for the people still trapped inside it, and in that realization, the tunnel around me seemed to stretch even darker. But there was a point of light ahead, narrow but real. The understanding that I could not let this continue, that something had to change, that the quiet steps I had taken so far were only the beginning of a much larger reckoning, not just for me, but for Maddie and for my mother, because whatever fear lived in that house had followed me halfway across the world through a photograph, and I could not look away. I told my commanding officer I needed 48 hours to go home for a family event, and when he asked directly if everything was all right, I lied the way people from toxic family systems are trained to lie. I said it was just my mother's birthday. Nothing major. I would be back on time and ready to work on the flight into Cincinnati. I stared out the window as the city lights rose up through the haze, and I tried to map my revenge story's mind, like one of my mission overlays. Step 1, observe. Step 2, protect Maddie and Mom. Step 3, let the truth do what truth always does when you stop holding it back. But even with a plan in my head, my stomach twisted when I saw the old neighborhood again, the same cracked sidewalks, the same houses, sagging under years of quiet disappointment. My childhood street breathing, the same stale air of drama family it had always held. When I walked through the front door, Linda hugged me as if she were afraid I might vanish, her arms thin, but determined, her eyes shining with something that looked like hope and guilt mixed together. She said she was glad I could make it for her 60th. She said Rick had worked so hard to plan a party. She said this was important for family unity, and those words scraped against the inside of my chest, because unity in that house had always meant compliance, had always meant swallowing my own hurt to keep his temper from spilling. Rick stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel as if he had been the one doing the work. His eyes scanning my uniform-sized duffel bag, his mouth twisting in a smile that never reached his eyes. He did not say he was glad to see me. He only said so. The Navy finally let you come home. I hope you are ready to be useful for once. Then he tossed me a rag and pointed at the back door. Guests will be here in a few hours. There are chairs to wipe down, coolers to haul food to set up. Maddie was upstairs getting ready. He said she needed her time to look nice for the pictures, so it made sense for me to handle the heavy lifting. And just like that, the old hierarchy fell into place. In the hours before the party, I moved across the familiar backyard in a quiet rhythm, carrying tables, cleaning grill grates, lining trash cans, listening to Rick mutter instructions as if this were his operation. Not a celebration for my mother, but a stage for his image as a provider. Every time I glimpsed Maddie through the kitchen window, she was sitting at the table while Linda curled her hair, both of them laughing softly, and a small, selfish part of me wished I could trade places just once to be the daughter who did not have to earn a seat at the table with sweat. When the first cars pulled up along the curb, cousins and uncles and neighbors climbing out with grocery store cakes and gift bags, the air filled with the smell of charcoal and coleslaw and cheap perfume. The soundtrack of Midwestern summer gatherings where conflict, justice, and family betrayal often simmered beneath small talk. I slipped into the background, automatically handing people plates, refilling ice buckets, answering questions about the weather in California, about whether I still liked military life, always shallow, always safe. Nobody asking what it meant to sit in windowless rooms and decide where men would step in the dark. Rick floated from group to group, clapping shoulders, repeating the story he had crafted over the years, how he had held this family together with no help, how my job was mostly computer stuff, and nothing as dangerous as what real men did, and I watched as people nodded along, some because they believed him, some because it was easier than arguing. The first sharp twist came when Aunt Carol asked me what my plans were after the Navy, and I said I did not know that I was focused on my current assignment before I could say more. Rick swooped in and answered for me. He told them not to worry, that eventually I would grow out of this adventure phase and settle down, maybe even be smart enough to come back and help in the shop, take on some real responsibility. He said it with a laugh. But there was steel underneath. And when I did not laugh with him, he added loudly that I still had not sent much money home, that he and Linda had handled everything, that not everybody could disappear into revenge stories about the military and expect life to wait around. I saw the confusion in a few faces, people who had heard different rumors, but nobody challenged him. The old rule held. Rick spoke. Others adjusted their understanding. I stood there with the serving tongs in my hand and felt the label useless pressing down like a physical weight. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the sky turned the color of watered-down peach tea, he called for attention, tapping his fork against a beer bottle, and everyone obediently gathered near the patio. Plastic chairs scraping the concrete, my mother perched on the folding throne he had set up for her, a dollar store tiara in her hair, smiling hard enough to hide the worry in her eyes. He started with jokes. Little stories about Linda burning casseroles when they first dated, about her fussing over the thermostat, warm anecdotes that loosened the crowd. Then he shifted, as he always did, into something meaner dressed as comedy. He talked about raising children, how some kids stayed close and some ran off, how some daughters appreciated the roof over their heads and some acted like they had outgrown their roots. He gestured toward me lazily, saying, "Avery, here is our wanderer, our ghost, never around when the real work needs to be done." He told them I was so busy chasing glory that I never called unless there was something in it for me, that he and Linda had survived without a cent from me, that I left them to juggle mortgage notices while I played hero on a government paycheck. His words landed like small stones, each one seemingly harmless together, building a wall between me and the rest of the circle. Then came the line that made the world tilt. He looked right at me, voice amplified by beer and the attention of his audience, and announced that I was the most useless one in this family, that he sometimes wished I had never been born, because my existence only complicated things, and there was a ripple in the crowd, a few gasps, a few uncomfortable laughs. My mother stared down at her hands, twisting the cheap tiara ring on her finger. Maddie pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. Something in her posture, shifting as if a string inside her had snapped. I felt the familiar sting in my chest, the same sting I had felt at 17, at 20, at every age where he had found new ways to say the same thing, but this time there was another feeling braided through it, a low growing hum of anger that did not spin out of control but settled into a calm, cold clarity. The same clarity I felt in the ops center right before calling for a mission abort. Rick was not done. He never was. He decided to pull the Navy itself into his performance. He waved his bottle and said, "Avery thinks she is somebody now working with big bad special operations. But let us be honest. Those SEAL guys do not know who she is to them. She is just a number on a screen. If she walked onto one of their bases, they would not even stand up," and he laughed at his own line. A sharp bark that scraped down my spine, confident that he had reduced my service to a punchline. The back gate creaked. Then the sound almost lost under the murmur of the guests, and I saw my mother jerk her head toward the noise, her eyes widening. She had invited someone without telling me. A tall man stepped into the yard in civilian clothes that still could not hide the way he carried himself, shoulders straight. Movements controlled the kind of presence that made people instinctively move aside. Harrison Cole, Captain SEAL Commander, the same man whose life and whose team had once depended on my refusal to ignore a pattern nobody else saw. He gave my mother a brief, warm nod. Then his gaze found me where I stood by the folding table, my hands still on the serving tongs, my face probably pale in the golden light. Rick, unaware, turned to him with that same swagger he used on strangers he thought he could impress, asked if he was a friend of the family, maybe someone Linda worked with at the clinic. He chuckled and said, "If you are here about our girl Avery, I hope you are not expecting much. She is not exactly known for pulling her weight." Harrison did not look at him. He kept his eyes locked on mine, and then very slowly, in the middle of my mother's backyard, surrounded by people who had learned to see me through Rick's filter, he straightened his heels, clicking together on the concrete, his right hand coming up in a crisp salute, the kind reserved for respect, not obligation. His voice carried clean across the yard as he said, "Lieutenant Lockmom Task Force 7 and my SEAL team are alive. Because you refused to let us walk into a trap, my family and 12 other families owe you more than we can ever pay. Thank you." For one suspended second, everything stopped. Even the insects seemed to hold their noise. Plastic cups paused halfway to mouths. The phrase "quiet justice" flickered through my mind, because this was not a scream or a shove. It was truth laid bare. And in that silence, I felt every layer of revenge, emotional crash, and then finally begin to settle. The crowd slowly turned their attention from him to me, as if seeing me for the first time. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling before she could stop them. Maddie stared at me with something like awe, and Rick, caught with his cruelty exposed, gave a short, brittle laugh and muttered something about stories being exaggerated about people making too much out of a desk job. Harrison finally turned his head toward him, his expression cool and steady, and said, "You are free to believe whatever helps you sleep at night, sir. But in the Navy, we do not exaggerate the people who save our lives. That line sliced through the last thin layer of illusion left in that yard, and when Maddie suddenly stood her chair scraping loudly and said loudly enough for everyone to hear that she was tired of living with a man who called her sister useless in front of the whole family, I knew the balance of power in our little corner of toxic family history had shifted for good. When the yard finally thinned out and the last of the cars disappeared down the dark curve of the street, I stood for a moment in the quiet that followed the twilight smudged into night, and the smell of burnt charcoal lingering, and I felt the shift in the air the way I could sense atmospherics before a mission change, because once truth cracks open a lie, there is no way to patch it back together. And that was exactly what I saw happening around me as the guests drifted toward their cars, several of my aunts and cousins approaching me with wide eyes and hesitant voices, telling me they were sorry, telling me they had believed what Rick said because they did not know any better, telling me they never imagined I had done anything meaningful in the Navy because he always framed my work as clerical, a hobby that kept me busy rather than real service. One aunt even grabbed my hand and whispered that Rick had been bad-mouthing me for years, telling everyone I had abandoned the family, that I never sent money, that I was selfish. And as she spoke, I watched Linda standing behind her cheeks, pink with shame, blinking in that stunned way someone does when they hear the truth from outside their own home. For the first time, she looked lost and older than 60, as if all the years of denial and fear had rushed forward at once. Rick hovered near the back porch steps, arms crossed his jaw, working like he was chewing gravel anger simmering beneath his skin. Not the loud anger he used in crowds, but the tighter, more dangerous kind, the kind he reserved for behind closed doors. He muttered under his breath that Harrison had only come to show off, that I had probably begged him to play along, that the salute was staged to humiliate him, that everything tonight was designed to make him look small. He was already rewriting the narrative in his head, the same way he had rewritten my life for years, blaming me for the cracks forming under his feet. When everyone finally left, the silence felt heavy and unnatural, the kind of quiet that makes you brace for impact inside the house. The lights were too bright, and the kitchen counter was cluttered with half-eaten salad bowls and paper plates, and Rick snapped the back door shut with enough force to rattle the frame. He turned to Linda with that ugly sneer and hissed that she had embarrassed him, that she had allowed disrespect in his house, that she should have stood with him the way a loyal wife should, and he used the word loyal like a weapon pressed against her chest. Linda trembled and stepped back, and something inside me rose hotter and steadier than fear. I moved between them without thinking, my body blocking his path the same way I had stepped between armed men in tense mission rooms, and I told him plainly that if he touched my mother or my sister again, I would report him, that I was familiar with conflict justice, even within my own bloodline, that he did not get to rule this house through intimidation anymore. His eyes widened for a split second, then narrowed, and he lifted his hand as if to strike me years of his control, condensed into that one motion. But he stalled when Linda let out a sharp cry, a terrified plea that snapped the tension just enough, and I kept my gaze locked on his, letting him see the part of me that had learned to steady herself in chaos, the part shaped by intel work and field stakes, the part that did not flinch at threats. I knew he saw it because something flickered across his face, something that looked like the recognition that he was not dealing with the same girl he used to corner in hallways with his rants, and for the first time the balance felt like it had shifted just a little. Later, when he stormed into the living room to pace and mutter, I slipped my phone out quietly and recorded the remnants of his shouting, the accusations, the threats he hurled at the walls. Then I photographed the overturned chairs and the cracked picture frame he had slammed earlier, not to use as ammunition, but to build a record, a quiet justice archive he did not know existed. And I texted the files to Noah, a friend from the local police department, asking what the protocol was for documenting household intimidation and whether a restraining order required physical harm or could be supported by patterns of emotional volatility. Noah responded quickly saying the documentation was good and that he should keep going. He told me to be careful to get my mother and sister somewhere safe if things escalated, and as I slipped my phone back into my pocket, I felt the first layer of legal protection forming beneath us, invisible to Rick, but very real. The house settled into a fragile stillness after midnight. Linda had retreated to her room, eyes red, her hands shaking as she passed me in the hallway, whispering thank you in a voice so thin it barely existed. And Maddie lingered at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with a conflicted expression, fear mixed with something like admiration. The overhead light cast a soft glow around her, and for an instant she looked much younger than 19. Then she walked down slowly and stood beside me, her voice barely above a breath as she said, "If you leave, I am leaving too. I cannot stay here with him anymore. I want out. Please take me with you." Those words hit Rick harder than anything I could have said, because Maddie had always been his last claim to power, the one person he believed he still controlled, and the knowledge that she was willing to walk away with me meant the foundation of his authority had started to crumble in real time. I put my hand on her shoulder and told her quietly that she would not be left behind, that this family structure he had built out of fear and guilt was already breaking, and she leaned into me like someone who had finally stopped pretending she was not afraid, the air thick with betrayal. Family karma circling back. When she went upstairs, I remained in the dim hallway for a long moment, listening to the low rumble of Rick, pacing in the living room, feeling the tension coil and uncoil like a loaded wire, knowing the fallout had only just begun, but also knowing something irreversible had shifted tonight. Truth had stepped into the light and refused to step back, and when truth enters a toxic family, it cracks every lie down the middle, leaving the abuser to finally face the silence they created alone and unprotected by the shadows where they used to thrive. The fallout from the birthday night spread faster than smoke through dry brush, and within a week the carefully crafted image Rick had spent years polishing began to dull in places he never expected. Whispers moving through the extended family, small comments exchanged in the grocery store parking lot, questions that floated around the church corridors each Sunday like drifting ash. And though no one said it to his face at first, he could feel the shift, the sidelong glances, the lack of eager greetings, the way conversations paused when he approached. The pastor, a man who had always entertained Rick's loud stories with patient interest, finally pulled Linda aside after service and asked in a low voice if everything at home was all right. He said he had heard troubling things about the way Rick spoke to her daughters. He said he felt compelled to check in because spiritual guidance meant addressing emotional wounds too. And Linda, who had spent years minimizing her pain, could not hide the tremor in her hands. The pastor's concern became fuel for rumors, not of Avery being absent or ungrateful, but of Rick being volatile, dismissive, and cruel. And the more people looked back, the more his past comments took on a new shape. His shop began to suffer almost immediately, not because Avery had said anything, but because truth has a way of bleeding into the open once the first crack appears. A longtime customer accused him of swapping new parts with cheaper ones after noticing discrepancies in an invoice word spread that he overcharged elderly clients. And while Rick tried to brush it off as misunderstandings, he could not stop the momentum his debts accumulated under the surface, like rot. The gambling he thought he had hidden resurfaced in overdue bills, and the lender for his shop equipment began leaving messages hinting at repossession. Every corner he turned seemed to lead to another wall. It was on a Wednesday night when my phone finally lit up with his name. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the echo of every insult he had ever thrown at me, every time he had called me useless. And yet I answered, because I needed to see which version of him would show up. His voice was startlingly soft, lined with a kind of forced humility that felt foreign. Coming from him, he called me kiddo, a word he had not used since I was 12. He said the birthday party had gotten out of hand. He said he had been stressed and had said things he did not mean. He said he was getting older and maybe did not see things clearly anymore. Then he shifted the conversation quicker than a wrench slipping off a bolt and told me he needed my help. He said the shop was struggling and he knew I could get a military-backed loan or some kind of assistance. He said I was a hero now and heroes had access to programs ordinary people did not. He said if I helped him, he would promise to make things right to fix our family to stop the fighting. I listened quietly, letting his words flow like oil from a cracked pan, thick and slippery, noting carefully how he never once apologized for calling me useless in front of half the family, how he never acknowledged the damage he had done to my mother or Maddie, how he never said he was wrong, only that he needed something from me now, and when he asked if we could meet at a diner near his shop so we could talk face to face, I agreed because some confrontations need to happen in person to settle the truth. The diner smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner when I walked in. The booths cracked and faded, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. He was already seated at a corner table, hunched slightly as if trying to appear smaller and more sympathetic. A posture I recognized as manipulation rather than remorse. He motioned for me to sit and immediately launched into a shaky monologue about bills, unfair customers, unsupportive employees, the impossible economy, everything except his own choices. Then his voice thickened and he let out a few choked sounds, meant to resemble tears wiping at eyes that stayed mostly dry, and between those theatrical breaths, he slipped in comments about how families should stick together, how I owed him at least a chance to repair things, how a daughter should help a father figure in need. I waited until his performance thinned out and the plates clattered in the kitchen behind us. Then I told him calmly that I would help my mother and I would help Maddie, but I would not be helping him. I told him his choices had led him to this point, that his debts and his anger and his lies were his responsibility. I told him he had lost the right to expect anything from me the moment he chose humiliation over respect year after year, and his expression hardened instantly, the mask slipping as he realized his attempted redemption arc was failing. Inside my mind, I could feel that quiet justice rising again, that steady understanding that sometimes helping someone means refusing to be their crutch. That silent revenge does not require shouting or cruelty, only the refusal to feed a system that was built to consume you. He leaned back, his face twisting, accusing me of turning cold because of the Navy accusing me of letting outsiders fill my head with nonsense, and I let him talk until the bitterness burned itself out. What he did not know, what he could not even imagine, was that behind the scenes, I had already taken steps to protect the people who still mattered a few weeks earlier. Jade and I had met in her small office with its stacks of legal books and tidy desk, and she helped me draft the amendments that would safeguard my mother's assets, ensuring that if Linda ever filed for divorce, Rick would have no claim to her home, her savings, or her life insurance. We also adjusted the will so that everything she owned would go to Maddie and me with specific clauses preventing Rick from challenging distribution or benefiting even indirectly. It was not vindictive, it was necessary, a form of revenge, inheritance drama family, that served to close a door he had been pushing his way through for years. As I sat across from him in that diner, I let him believe he still held bargaining power, that he could appeal to guilt or sentiment. Because sometimes the most effective revenge is letting someone walk straight into the consequences they built. He talked circles around himself, searching for pity, insisting he had been misunderstood, insisting I owed him grace. But the truth he had feared for so long was settling over him, inch by inch. He was losing control, not because someone attacked him, but because someone finally stopped submitting to his narrative. When I stood to leave, he asked where I was going in a tone that was half plea and half command, and I told him I was going back to my mother's house to help her pack a few things. I told him there were limits to what anyone should endure, even in a family, and his face paled just enough to betray his fear as he asked if she was leaving him. I did not answer. I simply walked out into the cool night air and let the silence speak for me, knowing that for the first time, He understood the cost of his cruelty and the fact that the reckoning had only begun. 6 months passed in a way that felt unreal, not rushed or chaotic, but slow enough for every piece of my life to settle into its rightful place, as if all the broken parts I had carried since childhood finally had permission to be put down, and during those months, the quiet reconstruction of my family happened one decision at a time. Linda filed for divorce in early spring, her signature trembling just a little as she handed the paperwork to the clerk, not from fear, but from the weight of releasing 30 years of habit. And when the judge approved the temporary separation, she moved into a small one-bedroom apartment overlooking a modest row of maple trees. The space was simple and sunlit. Nothing fancy, nothing loud, simply peaceful in a way she had never been allowed to feel. She told me she slept through the night for the first time in decades. No yelling, no footsteps, pacing the hallway, no waiting for an explosion that might never come. Maddie began community college in the fall, commuting by bus, working 20 hours a week in a campus bookstore, attending therapy sessions arranged through a nonprofit I had connected her with. She started speaking differently too, her sentences firmer, her eyes brighter. Less darting toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. She told me she had stopped hearing Rick's voice in her head, calling her clumsy or stupid. She said it felt like someone had finally reached in and turned off a noise she'd been forced to live with since she was a child. Rick, on the other hand, fell into his own collapse, not sudden or dramatic, but steady, the inevitable unwinding of a life built on control. Once Linda left and the truth circulated through the family, there was no one left to hold his reputation together. Customers disappeared from his shop one after another. The repossession truck eventually hauled away the equipment. He could not pay for a few relatives who once hung on his every word. Now crossed the street to avoid being pulled into his bitterness, he blamed everyone but himself, cycling through excuses, insisting he had been betrayed, insisting the world had turned against hard-working men. Yet no one came to sympathize. The truth had eroded the pedestal he built for himself, and now he stood in the rubble alone. As for me, I returned to Coronado after the leave period ended, reassigned to work as an intelligence instructor for incoming officers, a quieter role than my previous operational assignments, but one that allowed me to shape minds, to sharpen instincts in younger analysts, to teach them how to read what others miss, and every now and then a SEAL from Task Force 7 or someone who had heard the stories would stop by to thank me, their respect always offered in the understated way. Military people show gratitude. Small nods, firm handshakes, a cup of coffee left on my desk during long nights, and every gesture felt like a soft reversal of the years I had been told I was useless. The nickname Ghost Compass began surfacing beyond the classified circles mentioned in training briefings and passed between teams like a piece of quiet lore. They spoke of an analyst who saw danger in the noise, who trusted her instincts even when others doubted. They spoke of missions turned safe because of a pattern she detected of families spared grief. And though they never said my name in public channels, everyone knew who they meant. It was the strangest healing I had ever experienced, becoming a myth of capability in a community that valued truth over noise, especially when my own home had spent years insisting I had none. The moment the circle closed completely came during a late summer event for military families, a gathering hosted in an auditorium near the base rows of chairs filled with spouses, parents, siblings, and service members. I had been invited to speak on a panel about resilience and support systems, specifically the tension between toxic family environments and the steady structure found in military communities. I agreed because I knew too many young service members who carried the same silent wounds I once did, the ones inflicted by the people who were supposed to love them. When it was my turn, I stepped to the podium, the lights soft and warm, and I spoke calmly about growing up in a home where criticism was constant and affection conditional. I explained without naming names how family betrayal shapes your self-worth, how years of being told you are small can make you forget how capable you are. I described how the Navy became the first place where people judged me by my skills instead of my obedience. how standing up for yourself is not disrespect, but survival. How healing sometimes requires choosing distance instead of endurance. I watched the audience carefully as I talked older women in the crowd nodding slowly, younger service members taking notes, a few quiet sniffles in the second row. When the panel ended, an older woman approached me with deliberate steps, her gray hair pulled into a careful twist, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and gratitude. She reached for my hands and held them tightly. She said she had always thought she was the only one treated poorly by her son-in-law, that she felt invisible and dismissed in her own home. She said hearing the truth from someone younger, someone who had turned that pain into strength, made her feel less alone. She said, "Your story is revenge through truth, and it helped me breathe again." And I felt something tender settle into my chest because her words were larger than the moment. They were validation that every part of the journey had meaning beyond my own healing. After the event, I stood outside beneath the evening sky, the air warm and still, and I thought of the people who would one day hear this story the way you are hearing it now. People who had lived with toxic family dynamics and thought endurance was their only option. People who needed to know that quiet justice is sometimes the strongest kind, not the justice that roars, but the justice that simply refuses to let cruelty win. And if you watching this have ever lived inside a toxic family, if you know the sting of family betrayal, if you have carried the weight of being underestimated or dismissed, then I want you to share a piece of your story in the comments. Not because you owe anyone your past, but because speaking truth is the first step toward reclaiming respect. This space is for silent revenge and emotional resilience, for choosing dignity over money, for finding truth and closure that allows you to breathe again. Every lesson in betrayal can become justice. Without hate, if you allow yourself to stand in your own strength. And if you want to hear more revenge emotional stories, more conflict justice, arcs where the hero does not need to shout to be powerful, where the truth itself becomes the final victory, then subscribe to the channel, because sometimes revenge through truth is the only path that leads the heart back to peace.